I was just talking to somebody, and they're going through a hard time in their life. And like a lot of people who are going through a hard time in their life, she's sensitive now and projecting, which means instead of dealing with the actual issue that is in front of you, you take all the intensity and the emotion you have for this actual thing that you're dealing with, and then you project it onto another person, another situation, and you become like insanely upset at the checkout person at the grocery store for the disrespect they showed you by not asking you if you wanted paper or plastic, because you're not dealing with some kind of major problem in your life. So you take that and you, actually, that's transference. Okay, that's transference. All right, sorry. I got I'm sitting in front of a social worker. Somehow, like, your presence is making me look at myself and be like, wait a second, that's transference. So yeah, you're guilty of transference. Then projection is your issue and what's bugging you. You think that somebody else, like, that's their issue, but actually it's yours. And you can't be courageous enough to admit it's your issue, so you put it into somebody else's mouth. You're like, you must be angry at me. And you're like, actually, you're angry, and you're projecting that onto me. You follow? So what we're dealing with is transference. But when uneducated people talk about this, they oftentimes get these two phenomena confused with one another. Anyway, to get back on point, a lot of times when you've got heavy stuff going on in your life you can't deal with, you end up blaming people or getting really angry at people or getting real sensitive about people way in excess of what they deserve, because it's a way for you to give voice to some kind of pain that you're experiencing that you're not mature enough and courageous enough to deal with head on. You follow that? I'm just going to say it again because I butchered it by switching the words. I'm dealing with somebody right now, I'm counseling somebody right now who has suffered a major life trauma. And I've noticed that they don't want to talk about the major trauma in their life that's going on right now. What they want to talk about is everything else under the sun. And everything else under the sun is on steroids, and it's 100 times worse than it actually is. And everything else under the sun is the worst thing ever, because they're transferring all of the anxiety and pain and frustration and sadness and anger they have about event A that they don't want to deal with, and now event B through Z, which are microscopic in comparison to this event, they all become infinitely more significant. Do you guys follow this? Actually, this is really like addiction. This is what happens with addictions too. When I'm counseling people who are addicted to drugs or sex or anger, or people have eating disorders even, when people are going to engage in that deleterious behavior, that harmful behavior, when people are like, I really want to stop doing whatever, I really want to stop drinking or smoking pot or masturbating, or whatever it is that they're struggling with. My advice is relatively the same. Each particular addiction has its own little nuances. But the core of them all is the same. If you want to stop from engaging in a deleterious behavior, in a harmful behavior, what you have to do is, when you're stressed out about something, when you feel like you want to, whatever the coping mechanism is, when you feel like you want to do that, like drinking, for instance, and you're trying to be sober, what you do is you stop. When you get that thought in your head, like, oh, I should go drink, you stop and you ask yourself, what big thing is going on in my life that I don't want to deal with right now? What major issue is occurring in my life that I don't want to deal with? What's stressing me out that I don't want to think about? If you stop and deal with the actual thing that's stressing you out, full on, right there, like you stop, you say, I'll take a half an hour and I'm going to deal with this actual event that's really disturbing me, that I feel like I can't even touch, that's radioactive. I'm going to go deal with it. I'm going to journal about it. I'm going to talk to somebody about it. I'm going to open it. I'm going to start to dig into it. I'm going to start to like get into it. Your desires to engage in that negative behavior will evaporate almost magically, like they were never there. Did you guys follow that? Like, oh, I want to cut myself. Okay, so like, what's stressing you out right now? What's bothering you? What should you be working on right now? Go work on that for half an hour diligently. Even there's no solution. Even all you do is write a pro and con list. Even all you do is journal about it in a stream of consciousness. Even all you do is open up to one friend about it and cry about it. Even all you do is think about it and cry about it. Your desire to engage in a negative behavior will go away magically. The negative behavior really just messes with your dopamine level and your other neurotransmitters enough to make it easy to forget. We dabble in bad behavior, but then it starts to affect your mesolimbic pathway and it gets hardwired into you. Then it becomes an addiction, and then it's formidable. Like, I used a lot of cocaine for a brief period of time as a child. From the ages 15 and 16, I used a lot of cocaine in the 80s, crack cocaine. It took me years to get over it. Years. Like, I was like a brahmachari living in the ashram, and I would still dream about it sometimes. It took years for it to really go away. Once it gets hardwired, it's much more formidable. It's much more difficult. You can do it, but man, I try to get, like, when I see somebody liaising with or dabbling in a negative pattern of behavior that I know can lead to like an addiction and a habit, I try to leap into the fray and stop it, like whatever I can do, because I don't want it to go from an experiment into an addiction, because then it's a whole different animal. Then it's your go-to. when I was a young devotee, I was talking to one of my elders. He's a cinematographer. And somehow he got the gig of filming the Tropicana swimsuit video for, like in whatever it was, 1990. So Tropicana, I don't even know what Tropicana is. I mean, it's like a suntan lotion or something like that. It's right? It's Tropicana suntan lotion. So they would have like a swimsuit. Maybe it was like an issue of a magazine, or maybe it was a competition or whatever. So Tropicana swimsuit model competition. And so they would video it, and like people would, I guess, rent the video from, from Blockbuster, which is precursor to Blockbuster. It was well before Blockbuster. It used to be that record stores would rent VHS tapes. Your average record store would have a section of VHS tapes. That's how it was in the 80s. There were no dedicated video stores. There were record stores, and then the record stores would double as video rental places, pre-Blockbuster. Anyway, so I was a brahmachari in the ashram, and he came back to the temple, and he was like, yeah, I just got done videoing the Tropicana swimsuit issue. And I was like, that sounds horrible. Like, that's like really rough, dude. Like, how'd you cope with that? And he's like, I just went and got myself a milkshake and just like chilled out and just like, I had to take a deep breath and just like, and so it's like, how did he deal with the lust or the agitation? He went and got some fat and some sugar and like consumed large amounts of fat and sugar to sort of sedate himself, You know what I mean? And got himself a nice pancreas, insulin, got himself a nice insulin hit, regulated his serotonin levels, and kind of like probably a little oxytocin was thrown in there as well, and just sort of like made it all better, took the edge off. It's also important to figure out healthy ways of coping. Like my guru told me that when it gets really stressful and like he just can't like cope with life and life gets really hard, he chants japa. And like he has to chant like a lot of japa every day. And if like, it's 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the afternoon and he hasn't chanted enough rounds, he starts to feel edgy and uncomfortable. And so he takes shelter of his japa. And he feels like he needs a daily dose of japa to keep him steady. You follow? That's pretty cool. When japa is your coping mechanism for stress, it's no longer a duty you perform. It's no longer your religious activity. But it's actually just the way you cope with the stress of the world, is you turn to Krishna and japa. That's a pretty nice coping mechanism. Sometimes I'll tell devotees, go get something to eat. Go eat something you shouldn't. Go eat too much. You'll feel better. Go sedate yourself. Of course, that can turn into an eating disorder, so you got to be careful. That's even that but you've got these coping mechanisms: exercise, sleep, japa, that are not detrimental to your mental and physical health, and that you can indulge in, and they're relatively benign. So I was counseling somebody today, and they were engaging in transference, which is when you get way more angry than you should at the guy at the grocery store because you're not dealing with the fact that you just got a divorce. To make it simple. Then you got projection, which essentially is like paranoia fantasies where everybody is like doing to you what you're actually doing. You follow? And so like I can't admit how I'm feeling, so I think somebody else is feeling that way. And it's a way for me to vocalize and give rise to it without owning it. Drug addiction, sex addiction, lying, anger, violence, eating disorders, even to some extent depression. There's different types of depression, but even to some extent depression. These are all transference in the ultimate issue. There are ways of doing something else to cope with life and focusing on something else because you don't have the courage to focus on what you need to be focusing on. As such, they all have a pretty standard solution, and that is to deal with the thing you don't want to deal with. To take half an hour and deal with the thing you don't want to deal with. Journal about it. Even just think about it. Even just pray to Krishna about it. Make a pro and con list. Research it. Whatever it is that's just too big, take a little nibble out of it. And your desire to engage in that transference, negative, debilitating, deleterious behavior, it'll evaporate. It'll work like a charm. It works like a charm forever. If you let somebody go too far down the road, once they get too involved in planning how they're going to do something wrong, it's too long. They've gone too far. They can't stop. You got to nip it in the bud right when it happens. Even when people are doing bad stuff, heroin or cutting themselves or whatever they might be doing, if you get somebody when they're dabbling, when they're experimenting, you can help them. Once it becomes an actual addiction, it becomes way more difficult. I just repeated myself a second time because I felt like you guys could do with hearing it a second time. Then it's important for people to have benign coping mechanisms. Chanting japa would maybe be at the top of the list of like munificent coping mechanisms, benign coping mechanisms. But exercise and journaling and talking to friends and different, like there can be very positive ways you can learn to cope with life, become habituated to cope with life by doing this. And then you got stuff which isn't that bad. Watching a little TV, eating too much, sleeping. It's not really like beneficial or super positive, but in moderation, these things are not going to damage you too much. Then you got the ones that mess you up. Those are the ones you got to avoid. As you get older, you get over the straight vices, like the stuff they have AA groups for, 12-step groups for. Then some of the more subtle stuff, prejudices, judgments, resentment, anger. Then you got to start to contend with those. Ego. Pathos. Playing the victim. Then you got to start to contend with those. They're less addictions and they're more maladaptive patterns of behavior. You follow? Maladaptive patterns of cognition. And you start to work on that more subtle ground. Sometimes you can work on those and it can help you with the vices. Usually you clear the vices out first and then you can start to deal with these things. They're too subtle. If you're dealing with the big stuff, you can't work on these because they're too subtle. Your brain isn't peaceful enough to fathom the big subjects because you're dealing with just like kind of the nuts and bolts of life. You have to have a little bit of quietude and dispassion to start to deal with pride and resentment and bitterness, selfishness. You know? So this was what I was doing right before I sat down to give class. And so I thought when I sat down, is there a verse from the Gita that will help to make this point, that relates to this thing I was thinking about? And I thought of a verse. And I'm going to read the verse to you, and then we can think about how it's related. It's kind of an obscure connection. And so we'll look over this verse. I thought it had some value. Apuryamanam achala pratishtam always being filled but never moving, but situated unmovingly. Samudram apa pravishanti yadvat. Just as the ocean, samudra, is being filled by water. Waters are entering. Apa pravishanti. The waters there entering into the ocean, which is always being filled, but which is never moving. Just like that. Yadvat. Just like that. Tadvat. Kama yam pravishanti sarva. Just like that. Sashantim apnoti nakama kami. Just like that. A person achieves peace when they let all of their desires enter into them like that, but not for the people who try to fulfill the desires. Kama kami means the people who desire their desires is literally what it means. So let me say it again. It's a little complicated. Let me say it again. I'm going to read Prabhupada's beautiful translation. Just like the ocean is always being filled with waters, but never moves. Do you understand what's being communicated? You have an ocean which stays in its banks, more or less. But there's rivers always going into the ocean, but then the water's evaporating off the ocean, and the white water cycle's there, so the ocean just doesn't get bigger and bigger and bigger. Maybe it gets microscopically bigger, but you don't really notice it getting bigger. It's able to have those waters come into it, and it just doesn't move. It just stays in its banks. You follow? Tadvat. Just like that. Sa shantim apnoti. Someone achieves peace when Kama pravishanti sarva. When all the desires go into them like that. Go into them and they don't become unnecessarily agitated. Na kama kami. But they won't achieve peace if they desire to fulfill all those desires that are anyways always coming. You follow? That's the verse. A person who is not disturbed by the incessant flow of desires that enter like rivers into the ocean, which is ever being filled but always still, that person can alone achieve peace, not the man who strives to satisfy such desires. Did you guys follow the simile? So you have an ocean which is steady, and rivers are going into it, but the ocean is staying steady. It's achala pratishtam. It's staying steady. Then you've got the person, and they've got desires kind of coming into their brain, but they stay steady, like the ocean. That person, who's like the ocean, achieves peace. The presence or absence of desires does not determine. It's your response to those desires which determines it. And who doesn't achieve peace? The person who gets into. They desire their desires and they get all wrapped up in them. And they feed into it and they get all agitated by those desires. That person doesn't achieve peace. Do you guys follow that? Okay. That was the verse I thought of. As I read it, I was like, oh, that's a pretty easy connection to make. But the connection I made was a little bit abstract. Let's see if you guys can get it. What's the connection between that verse and what I spoke about? Loud.
Just like what you spoke about was the value of not getting attached to your like negative thought processes or negative behaviors.
Ian, can you hear her? Give me a thumbs up if you can. Good. Keep going.
This verse describes the value of not getting attached to your desires, which would be in the same sense, would be, in this case, negative behaviors or maladaptive thought processes.
All right, so the people in the Gita aren't running with their desires too far. And I mentioned how if you're addicted to something negative, by not running with it too far and facing up to life, then you'll be successful in your sobriety. And so you made that connection, right? That wasn't what I was thinking of. I mean, it's the obvious connection. And so when I read it, I was like, oh, that's the obvious connection. That wasn't what I was thinking of. Does anybody else have any other thoughts about it? Here's what I was thinking. As you encourage someone to talk about their childhood, talk about their pain, talk about their trauma, feel their feelings, get into stuff, open up, take their skeletons out of the closet and put them on full display. As you encourage someone to do that, which is standard talk therapy, and it's kind of like the cornerstone of CBT, and it's just cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's just kind of like, it's just sort of like, that's what it is. That's what you encourage people to do. The Gita has something to add to that, which is just not to take it all so seriously. Because you're a soul, because you're not the body, you can be a little zen about the stuff in this material world. I had a friend. He was younger than me. When I joined the Hare Krishna movement, I was a couple of years older than this kid named Jiva. Interestingly, Jiva was the son of the cinematographer I mentioned who did the Tropicana swimsuit shoot. And I actually thought about Jiva earlier today for the first time in years. I don't think about Jiva much. Jiva was killed in a gun accident in 1990. So it's been 30 years since Jiva died. I knew Jiva as I was becoming a devotee. When I was 16, he was 14. When I was 18, he was 16. We were friends. He was younger than me, and I was kind of moving forward in my Krishna consciousness, and Jiva was the child of a devotee. And so he was around the temple just like so many children of devotees come around the temple. He fell into a little bit of a rough crowd. We good? Hang on. We had to mute Krishna Priya. She's getting weird on the mic. So, Jiva, he was still smoking ganja when I was sober, and he was maybe running around with a little bit of a tough crowd when I gotten away from that. And he looked up to me a bit, and he would come to me to confide me, and I always gave him really good advice because his father was a Prabhupada disciple, and I was an aspiring devotee, a new devotee, and I wanted to be good to this kid. I didn't want to take him down a dark road, so I always gave him big brotherly advice. And he was at a party, and there was a shotgun there, and somehow he got killed with a shotgun. It's still to this day seems like suspicious circumstance. They said the gun went off accidentally. I always I'm always cynical about that stuff, about guns going off accidentally, and killing people. But that's what the police report was, and that's how it got settled out. It was an accidental death from gunfire. So this kid was 16 or something like that, and his dad had to, cremate his son. Just brutal. It's just absolutely, positively brutal. Such a nice kid too. So I was talking to Dad about it. Some months later we were talking because we were friends. I mean, friends. He's my elder. He was, old enough to be my father. But we had a friendly relationship, and so we were talking. And I really wanted to get into his pain with him, I thought he must be tortured, and I wanted to talk to him about his pain. He was pretty zen about the whole thing. I did my best, and he's gone now, and he's gone on to another life, and I have to let him go and move on to my own life. And I thought, you must not be really feeling your feelings enough. You must not be getting into it enough. And maybe he wasn't. I remember thinking this at the time. But reflecting back on it today, I think to not get hopelessly lost and enmeshed in this material world in a way that almost guarantees to lead you to an abyss of nihilism and like an existential dilemma of what is this all about? It's such a nightmare. Everything is grinded into nothing. And it's just all useless. To not wind up there, you have to understand you're the soul and not the body, and there's a price you have to pay. That realization comes at a cost, and it means you have to be willing to let go of stuff in this world. When the bell rings, when it's time. And so it's kind of like this cool ratcheting. Like when you ratchet something forward, you move it side by side and it moves forward like that. You know what a ratchet is? So it's kind of like a really cool, of course the word ratchet also means ghetto, but anyway, I'm using the term ratchet in its standard usage. Amongst educated people. Definition 1 in a dictionary. So it's a little. You have to do two things at once. On one hand, you got to be honest and open, and in some ways, eviscerate yourself. and expose yourself to the light and own your feelings and your experiences and not run from them. On the other hand, you have to not take it that seriously because we're souls and we're not this body. That combination is potent. And so the verse speaks of a detachment. And it's complementary to everything I said previously. And without that complementary dose of detachment, you end up taking things in this world way too seriously, and you obsess over them, and they eat away at valuable time when you could be thinking about Krishna and moving forward. And ultimately, we have to let go even of these bodies. What to speak of like petty resentments we have as children. You know, I know so many, I'm going to be one of them soon enough. It's like 65-year-old men blaming their parents for why they are the way they are. At some point, whatever happened, that's what happened, but you're responsible for what you do with it. And we're going to have to let go of these bodies, what to speak of all of our relationships in this world, and unless we chasten ourselves with, it's okay, unless we chasten ourselves with a basic understanding that this is not ultimately our home, that we are bigger than this world, that there's something bigger going on, then your healing in this world becomes wallowing. And you don't go anywhere, you just stay here. And you get real comfortable here, and you heal here. But the basic disease of materialism goes on unabated. We have to interrupt that materialism by having a higher conception of self, fathoming the biggest things in the universe. And while we're doing that, we've got to work on our issues. And these issues become, to some extent, defanged. They lose their potency because they're seen for being on a much lower level. But we don't just pretend they don't exist and bury them. And so these two things together are a really powerful combination. So the reason I thought of the verse is because I thought, as a spiritualist, we don't just counsel people. We don't just teach people how to be happy in this material world. We teach them how to be happy in this material world and then move beyond it and let go of it. And that's something we have to give, and that's something we have to own that therapists don't. That's what it means to be a spiritualist. We got to go through all the regular therapy that people have to go through, of sharing our pain and getting over our vices and learning how to cope with life and learning how to be functional, healthy adults in this material world who take responsibility for their life and are on it and own it. We got to do all of that, and we have to simultaneously cultivate the idea that we're the soul and not the body. So all of this is just taken down a notch. And this is what the spotlight is shined on. Not in a way where this is run away from, but in a way where, with the light shining on it, this becomes more important. Did you guys follow that? Did that make sense? So just to wrap it all up with a bow tie. And so, to bring it back before I summarize the whole thing, I think there's some truth in what my friend said. He said to me that, Jiva's already taken birth somewhere else. He was my son for a certain amount of time, but he's had to move on in his journey, and I have to too. That's what it means to be a devotee. Whether or not that was his time, whether or not he meant it or not, whether or not he had some stuff he needed to deal with, I don't know. It's not in my purview to be able to make that judgment. He's not my junior. But the truth he spoke in that regard, even in the midst of his greatest suffering, it really rings true for me. 30 years later. It's been 30 years since Jiva passed. And it rings true. So to wrap it up, I'm counseling somebody and they're transferring the intense suffering that they should be going through, and they're getting really angry at the guy in the checkout counter for relatively small stuff, because that's transference. And I do this, and I assume everybody else probably does too, because I see it all the time in myself and others. It's fairly common. It's because we're cowards and we don't want to deal with the actual issue that we need to be dealing with. And a lot of times that leads to negative coping patterns that can get really debilitating and can really stop your forward progress. And there's a solution to those, which is just to deal with the thing you don't want to talk about. Just to talk about it. To wrap your head around it. Not even to solve it, just to touch it. And then those desires to do negative things will go away. Everybody needs to take off the edge in some ways, and so we should develop healthy coping mechanisms, or at least neutral coping mechanisms. But we should be real careful about the negative ones, and we should never get past the dabbling phase with those so they don't turn into actual addictions, because they're hard to get over. But the process is the same. You just deal with life on its own terms. You be brave. And when I was thinking about all that, I thought of this verse in the Gita, and the obvious connection with the verse in the Gita, which is that the spiritualist is like an ocean. And even though desires may enter within the consciousness of that spiritualist, he remains fixed in his commitments. He's not somebody who just runs after their desires like a child, chasing a shadow. So easily agitated. That person will never find peace. But the person who doesn't take their desires so seriously will achieve peace. And the obvious connection is that, don't indulge in those addictive patterns of behavior. Be more Zen. But that's not what I was thinking of. What I was thinking of was, while we dole out therapy to people, while we help people to heal, while we heal ourselves, while we grow and have the courage to deal with our own issues, we need to simultaneously cultivate a real deep understanding that we are not of this world. We don't let go of the responsibilities of going through therapy. We just have this extra thing that we're doing on top of it all. And it makes it much more beautiful. It doesn't lead to sort of like nihilism and like this hopeless staving off of the inevitable entropy of everything, but rather it shows you that this world is a train station, but you're still on a journey that's going to take you far beyond this world. And it gives you a dose of detachment, which is critical in the life of a spiritualist, because we're going to have to ultimately let go of everything material. And so we have to train ourselves in that now. And especially as we dip into our emotions and our thoughts and feelings and so on and so forth, we have to remind ourselves that we have miles to go before we sleep. Okay, thoughts, discussion. We got Ian. Many people use religion as a negative coping mechanism. Yes. To avoid working on their personal issues. Yes. How do we use our spiritual worldview in a healthy way so we don't sweep our issues under the rug and pretend we're transcendental? Well, if I wasn't online, Ian, given that we know each other for 20 years and we're friends and we have like a long-standing relationship, if I wasn't online, I would be like, your question is so stupid. How could you even write this question to me? It's so dumb. I already answered your question entirely. But I'm not going to say that because I would look like a jerk. And so I'm saying we have to do all the regular therapy. We're not saved because we're Hare Krishnas. We have to do all the regular work and cultivate a transcendental attitude. And both things have to go on. And we got to walk and chew gum. And we're not given a free ride. And we don't get to run away from our problems and our issues on a boat of transcendence. And we have to address our vices, both the gross ones as well as the subtle ones. And we have to do all that internal work and fully clean house, strengthened by our spiritual knowledge. And so my entire class was dedicated to answering your question. And so your question seems nonsensical. I would never call it stupid because that would be rude and disrespectful, but it seems nonsensical. Do you want to unmic? Do you want to turn your mic on and comment?
That clarified it. I mean, say all that, but I'm not going to say anymore. I'm not going to bring up myself here, but yeah.
My whole class was dedicated to not making that pitfall, to not going down that road, to not going down that, like, religion as a cover-up. You know? The whole class was trying to strike that balance. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
All right.
You did, yes.
All right, brother. Okay. Thank you, Varangi. Anybody else want to chime in?
It's me again. I was gonna write something, but then I'd rather speak if that's okay. So I really appreciate the 2 points that you made. The first one was that, a transcendentalist, a devotee, maintains some degree of detachment from the world, and that impacted me a lot because I guess society, at work, personally, I go through this where I see people reacting so much, and I feel like I should react just as crazy because otherwise, like, I don't belong, or they think I'm, like, callous or...
Let me cut you off. Just because I know you so well, I think sometimes you tend to be overly detached from things in this world. I think sometimes as devotees, we use our philosophy to be artificially detached from things in this world in a way that's unhealthy. We run away from painful situations in the name of transcendence. And I think to be a real devotee, we have to be incredibly empathetic and understanding of people. We have to be really gut-wrenchingly honest with ourselves and where we're at. And part of where we're at has to be that we have a deep, profound yes burning in our hearts. And when you look at a devotee and their zenness, it's because they have something really profoundly beautiful. And their transcendence is not callous. It's not resentful. It's not take your marbles and go home. It genuinely springs from a bright sun glowing in their hearts that's so powerful, it's their main love affair in this world. And if you want a little bit of a, I mean, interestingly, I'm the idiot, Ian, because I'm essentially answering your question now. So, there you go. If you want a little bit of a, if you want something like almost like a little bit of a cheat sheet or a hack, you look in your own heart. If you feel callousness or disgust or condescension or apathy or lethargy towards people who are suffering because of their materialism, that means you're running away from your own issues. When you really understand them and you just have something in addition to that that is like it's like an operating system that is involved in every aspect of your life. A huge yes, a big love affair, something that's the most important thing in the world to you. And you don't lack in compassion, you don't lack in empathy, you don't lack in your ability to understand people, you fully get it. And at the same time, you have a richness, and you have Krishna, and you love Krishna. And that's the most magical thing. Then you know you're doing good. You follow?
Yeah, thank you. This definitely helped. I'm glad that you elaborated on it.
Yeah, I'm sure Ian is too, and he's like, see, I did have a good question. All right, we got one more. If somebody wants to ask something or contribute something, we got one more. And I'm sorry for cutting you off, Varangi, but I realized based on what you were saying, I could say something that would be good for you and Ian, and I'm sensitive to time, and I had a sense of where you were headed. All right, Hare Krishna. Anybody else? Yeah, loud.
I just really appreciate the community of devotees who are willing to be open and talk about their issues and willing to listen if you're having issues, and it's just been really, really.
Ian, give me a thumbs up if you can hear him. Okay, continue.
Yeah, it's just been really valuable for me in healing stuff that I've been through, and I just find it it's really nice to have.
In a good community of devotees, there's subversive, radical, breathtakingly beautiful honesty. People looking at themselves, shining that light on themselves instead of on others.
Right.
And it's refreshing.
It's really refreshing.
It's refreshing. You get a bad group of devotees and they're a bunch of callous, judgmental, don't look at themselves people. So it's not like our whole gang is all perfect. But if you get a good crew, it's refreshing honesty, and it's infectious. And you're like, well, they can be honest, I can be honest too. And that's amazing. And that, coupled with a deep, profound philosophy, it's a match made in heaven. It's the yin and the yang. It's like a beautiful combination. And the last word with you? Loud.
Well, just thank you for the class. I really appreciate it. And when you read the verse, I was thinking about how deep the ocean is, and that's what keeps it still when the current's flowing in. The current's really fast. So if you go in that direction, I would imagine it's easy to get caught in the current, and how dangerous that could be. It's so much more challenging to do. So I'm seeing the value of hearing these reminders and not going down like that, not allowing yourself to indulge in those negative behaviors. And
did you hear that? Thumbs up, thank you. Yeah, I didn't explore this, and so it was an omission in my class. Oceans are deep. If you're shallow, then you get swept away by the rivers. If you're deep, you don't. If you want to be stable, you got to go deep. Deeper topics make you deep. If you're shallow, then you'll get swept away by stuff. And no philosophy in the world is going to save you. If you're deep, life will hit you with some real tidal waves, and you'll be able to navigate them. I remember reading a report, and we'll finish with this. There were some people off the coast of Thailand scuba diving when the tsunami hit in Sri Lanka. And they were scuba diving, and he described that they were scuba diving, all of a sudden like they were pulled up 10 feet. And they're like, well, that was weird. I mean, they didn't say it, but it was like a weird thing. They just kept scuba diving. Then they came up, and the entire coastline was decimated. Because the tidal wave had rolled over them while they were scuba diving. But they were deep enough that it was a mild inconvenience, whereas the coastline was just absolutely destroyed. Another amazing point, and we'll finish with this, is tough stuff happens in the life of devotees. Bad stuff also happens. People die. You get old. You get sick. People betray you. You get cheated. You lose. You know? That also happens to devotees. They're just deep. And so they can deal with that all gracefully and beautifully and magically, and they just keep getting better and better as life throws stuff at them. And so the verse is interesting in that it doesn't give you this Shangri-La version where devotees never have issues, never have problems, never have difficulties. They're just deeply profound people, and if you want to see something magical, look at the way devotees deal with adversity. Look at how the adversity brings out the best in them. Look at how old age is the friend of a devotee. You know? Everything is the friend of a devotee. Okay. We're going to call it. Thank you guys so very much. We'll talk to you soon. Hare Krishna.